right, we are back. So that's technically it for HTML. Like here on out, it'll be up to like online resources and references we point you to just to fill in your vocabulary for more tags and attributes. But like conceptually, that's it. There's attributes, there are tags, and there are attributes. And the rest of it really is just kind of a laundry list of capable, possible features. But it turns out, too, you'll see over time that you can even see the HTML for websites. So for instance, if I go over to harvard.edu in my browser, which I'll go ahead in just a moment here and do https://www.harvard.edu/enter, it again will pull up today's version of Harvard's website. And if I right click or control click on it again and go to inspect, you'll see those so-called developer tools. And earlier, we focused on the network tab just so we could see the HTTP stuff going on. But what I glossed over earlier was the so-called elements tab, which actually shows you the HTML underlying any web page on the internet. And so, for instance, here is the underlying HTML for Harvard's homepage as of right now. And aesthetically, some of it's been collapsed. So if I click on these various triangles, I'll see what's actually inside of. That is the children of some of these HTML tags. But here on out, if you're ever curious as to like how a web page made some feature visually, you can just literally use these developer tools built into your own browser just to see what the web developer actually did. And you can do things too like this. Like if you really like maybe, let's see. If you really like this menu in the top right-hand corner of Harvard's website, you can even right-click that or control-click that specifically, choose Inspect, and what browsers will do is jump to the HTML corresponding to that visual element on the page. And here you can see, though we've not talked about this tag before, there's a button tag, there's an ID attribute, and there's some other attributes as well that define that button. You can do other things, too, in the web page. Let me scroll down, for instance, here. And let's go to another one, like yale.edu here in today's theme. And suppose we want to do something like change the aesthetics of this website. Well, how about this over here, Life at Yale. Let's right click on this, choose Inspect. That's going to jump to that part of the page. And then notice what you can do here in this Elements tab. We can be a little playful and return today, Life at Harvard. And voila, we've now changed Yale's website, it would seem. So have we really? Like, hopefully hacking is not actually this easy. What did we actually do based on today's mental model? Like, I have changed the page, but yeah, I've just changed how it is for me, right? Because my browser, just like with Phyllis and Brian from the get-go, requested Yale's web page. I got back a virtual envelope containing that HTML, as we've now called it. My browser has a local copy. It's got its own tree, otherwise known as a DOM, document object model, built up in its memory. And yeah, I went to town and changed my copy of it. But of course, hopefully, I've not changed the actual server. And in fact, if I reload Yale's website now, hopefully, it will revert back to, indeed, yep, what it should be instead, Life at Yale. But this ability in your own browser, be it Chrome or Firefox or Edge or Safari, to have these built-in developer tools are very powerful because it's going to enable you to not only diagnose problems that will invariably arise in the coming weeks with your own code, but is also going to allow you to learn from other sites, like how you can do things and tinker as well. But up until now, we focused only on tags and attributes and on the structure of a web page. Let's now focus more on the aesthetics and fine-tuning that. It turns out that HTML has very limited support for anything aesthetic, like font sizes and colors and so forth. And in recent years, people have used necessarily a second language called CSS, not a programming language, again, a markup language, if you will, to just fine-tune the aesthetics of a page, font sizes, colors, margins, and all of that. So CSS is going to allow us to define a whole bunch of properties, which is just another group of people's terminology for key value pairs. Indeed, ever since week 5, like key value pairs are everywhere in the world, not just at like Sweetgreen and restaurants, but indeed under inline code and languages and technologies like these. So properties is the new word in CSS for what a moment ago we called attributes in HTML. But it's the same idea, just different vocabulary that you get used to over time. A few phrases I might use now and you'll hear in the coming days would be these: type selector, class selector, ID selector, attribute selector, which just refer to different techniques we're about to see that are going to allow you to control more precisely the aesthetics of specific things on the page. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to take our basic HTML, like we saw earlier, and we're going to introduce in the next few minutes just a couple of more tags and or attributes. One, we're going to introduce you to a tag called style, which nicely named allows you to control the style, the aesthetics, the visuals of the web page. Or we're going to introduce you to a link tag, which very confusingly does not give you a link that you can click on. It just links to another file that then gets automatically included or imported, to borrow our language from C or in Python. But same idea. This will allow us to include secondary files. And we're going to ultimately show you how you can leverage third-party frameworks, libraries that other people wrote, so as to not get stuck in the weeds of all the fine-tuning of aesthetics and just make pretty things fast so you can focus really on the intellectually interesting part, if that's your choice, of building the content, the site out, the application out yourself. All right, so with that said, let me go back to VS Code here. And let me go ahead and create a simple example called home.html, like a very simple home page for John Harvard, for instance. Let me give myself 3 paragraphs initially, the first of which is just going to have the person's name. The second paragraph is going to say something like, welcome to my home page, to greet visitors. And the third is going to be like a little footer, like copyright, how about John Harvard 1636, or something like that. All right, let me go back to my other tab as before, reload my index. There's my new file, home.html. And I'll click that. And you'll see, OK, I mean, this is sort of 1636 style web page. Super simple, all text, nothing really interesting going on there. But we can start to style it a little differently. Like if the title of the page is John Harvard, and then it's welcome to my home page, and then this less important footer, why don't we have the text be large, then medium, then small? So something arbitrary, but a little more nuanced. So let me go back to VS Code here. And in my home.html file, let me introduce not yet the style tag, but what I'm going to call temporarily the style attribute. Both indeed exist. This one's simpler, and it's going to be correct, but we'll see in a moment, not as well designed, arguably, as is often our narrative. So inside of the style tag, you can put this language called CSS, key value pairs, otherwise known as properties. The only way you know what properties exist, what keys exist, is by taking a class, reading a book, looking at an online reference, and we're going to give you just a sampling of what's out there. So suppose I want to control the font size of this first paragraph. I can literally say font-size, in all lowercase, colon, and then a word like large. Or I can specify 12 point or 18 point or something more precise like that, like from Google Docs or Microsoft Word. And suppose I want to make this text down here medium. Well, I'll do quote unquote font size colon medium. And down here, I'll do style equals font dash size small. So I'm going to start with just these 3 key value pairs, same key, but different values. I'll go back to my page, and in a moment, I'll reload. And it's going to be somewhat subtle, but watch how the font size do change when I reload now. All right, so got a little bigger, middle one's about the same, and the last one is a little smaller. What if I want to center it? Just like many web pages have the text like this centered. Well, I can separate these key value pairs with semicolons. And I'm sorry, semicolons are kind of sort of back with CSS, but I can do text dash align colon center. Strictly speaking, I don't need the last semicolon if there's no more key value pairs, but I'll just do it to be consistent. Text align colon center, and then down here, after another semicolon, text align colon center. All right, let's go back, reload. Now it's going to be much more obvious, the change. And we now have the beginnings of a home page. Still pretty basic, but at least it's a little more interesting. Turns out we can do a little better with the copyright symbol. Like most computers actually have support for a circle with a C in it. But you can't just do that with text like this. There's different ways to do this. You could copy paste it from like a website that already has it, so you don't have to figure out the magical keystroke on your Mac or PC. But there's also in HTML what are called entities. And you can actually specify using hexadecimal or decimal codes numbers like this, #169 semicolon after an ampersand. And this is a special symbol that you can look up in any online reference for like special characters that are hard or impossible to type manually at your keyboard. And this, let me zoom in just so it's obvious. If I reload now, instead of being 2 parentheses and a C character, now it's a proper copyright symbol. So you'll see these out there. They're not necessarily that frequently used nowadays, but it's good to know that they exist. But let me go back now to my code and propose that, while correct, This is arguably not very well designed. And even if you've never seen HTML, never seen CSS before, what instinct might you have for why this is poorly designed? Yeah. There's repetition, right? In general, in the past several weeks, C, Python, SQL, like repetition generally bad and sloppy, and it's not going to scale well. So the repetition I think you're probably alluding to is text-aligned center, text-aligned center, text-aligned center. Well, we can factor that out in CSS. The C in CSS means cascading. And this means that if you move some properties to like a parent or a grandparent, the children or grandchildren will inherit those properties. That is, they will cascade down the family tree, so to speak. And so let me go ahead and remove all of these, since I claim they're indeed redundant. And let me preserve just one of them by, well, let me do this. It's not quite right to put a paragraph inside of a paragraph. Like, that's just not a thing in English writing or in writing more generally. So I'm going to do one thing first. It turns out that these two are arguably not paragraphs, right? This is like a header, the body, the essence of the page, and then the footer. So if a paragraph isn't quite the right English semantics, you can actually use more generically a tag that's all over the internet called div for division of the page. And this is just a very generic term for like a big rectangular region that divides the page again and again, just so that you can think about different regions. Now that I have div, which really has no more meaning than that, it's a division of the page, interpret as you will, now I can have multiple ones of these. And let me go ahead and open a div tag here. Let me close a new div tag here. And then just to keep everything tidy, I'm going to highlight everything in between and hit tab, and that just automatically indents everything for me. Now I have 3 divs inside of another div, and that's totally fine. This is very commonly done. Now I'm going to do this. Style equals quote unquote text align colon center semicolon or not. And now I have some cascading capabilities. Now the parent of those 3 children, John Harvard, welcome to my homepage, and the copyright will now all inherit that property. So when I hit reload, nothing aesthetically has changed. Whoops, sorry. Nothing. Oh, I should have done reload slightly earlier. When you use a div instead of a paragraph, it actually gets rid of the space between those paragraphs. It just sandwiches them a little closer together. I can fix this in another way. But that aside, everything is still centered, and the text is still large, medium, and small. But I should have called out that change in the paragraph spacing. But we could bring that back before long if we wanted. Now, what more could I do to maybe improve this? Well, strictly speaking, I don't really need that parent div, right? Because these 3 divs inside already had a parent. So let me actually get rid of that new div just to undo what I did. I'll highlight this, and if you haven't seen this trick, Shift-Tab will unindent nicely, which is perhaps helpful. I could just put that text align center on the body tag. So text align colon center, quote unquote. This too would work as well, so long as you go up the family tree, so to speak, reload. And now, indeed, there's nothing aesthetically that has changed this time. But it turns out nowadays the web is getting a little more sophisticated. And even though you will see so many examples online in tutorials and books using div, 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 div all over the place, there are newer semantic tags. Semantic just means they have more meaning than this generic notion of a division. And if you look up a documentation for HTML, you'll see that if you want to have a header on a page, not a heading like H1, H2, but a header, there's literally nowadays a header tag. And this is marginally better because it now says what it is. Search engines like Google and Bing can detect, oh, that's the header of the page. Maybe we should use this and give it more prominence in the search results. You can then have a main part of the page, so literally a tag called main nowadays. You can literally have a footer of the page. And again, these are often useful for screen readers to help recite things verbally for folks who might otherwise not be able to read them. And probably these screen readers might highlight the header and the main part, but maybe might not spend time for the user on the footer, which is arguably a little less important semantically usually. Or search engines, again, now know what's the header, what's the footer, what's the main part of the page, so they know what to search and analyze. So this would arguably be a better design nowadays as well. But what else remains as a problem? Well, this is now getting a little bit more subtle and takes some experience, but this practice of putting HTML and CSS all in the same file, it's a little sloppy. Why? Because it means I'm commingling my data with the presentation thereof. Like the juicy stuff I care about, like John Harvard and the phrase, welcome to my homepage, and all of the aesthetics that I might want to change over time. And honestly, because everything is currently in one big file, it's going to make it really hard for me to collaborate with a classmate or a colleague at work so that maybe I do the HTML, they do the CSS. Like, not if you're all working in the same file. It would be a nightmare. Even if you use the VS Code sharing feature like Google Docs and both are typing at the same time, like you're going to mess up somehow. It'd be nice if we could separate these two languages. Well, one way to do that would be as follows. Let me get rid of all of the style tags, style attributes that I've added up until now on all 4 now of these tags. And let me introduce the style tag that we saw on the slide earlier instead. I'm going to go up here into the head of the page, which is where technically these style tags must go so that they're already loaded into memory before the body is even analyzed by the browser. And inside of this style tag, I'm actually going to select the HTML elements that I want to stylize, if you will. So if I want to change the body's aesthetics, I'm going to literally type the name of that tag, body, and then, curly braces are back also from C. Inside of these curly braces, I'm going to put text align center. So the key value pairs are the same. The only new thing I've done is I've moved some of the syntax up to this new style tag in the head. If I want to now control the header tag as well, I can use the same curly braces. This is convention to put the open curly brace on the same line, the closed curly brace on another. The browser doesn't really care, but this is a common CSS style convention. I'm going to do font size large, semicolon. Then for the main tag, I'm going to do font size medium. And then for the footer tag, I'm going to do font size small. So same exact thing, and it's admittedly a little bit more verbose. It's taking up more lines of code. It doesn't all quite fit on the screen. But if you scroll back down now, and you'll acquire an eye for this, this is just better. Like, it's just more compact. It's more readable. The content, the data jumps out, and there's no visual distractions like the CSS properties as before. Upside here, too, is that we don't actually need to this doesn't actually change the aesthetics. If I reload the same page, it still looks the same, but I've taken a step toward some slightly better design. But let me propose that there's other ways to do this too. We just selected things by way of their type. So that was a so-called type selector when I literally just specified the type of tag, body, header, main, footer. But there's other ways that now we can lay the foundation for making reusable CSS that you and colleagues and classmates can use and reuse in multiple files and even in multiple projects. So let me actually go ahead and do this. Instead of just very explicitly saying, I want the body to be centered, let me invent an adjective, if you will, and let me change this to .centered. And this new vocabulary word, centered, will literally mean text-aligned center. Let me go ahead here. And I'm just going to create a new adjective called large, a new adjective called medium, and a new adjective called small. They are deliberately consistent with what the properties do, but these are now my own vocabulary words, and they are called classes. So a class is just a collection of key value pairs, a collection of properties that you get to invent for yourself. And what it lets you do now is this. Now, if I want the whole body to be centered, I can add this tag, which we actually saw briefly in Yale's HTML, class equals centered. Down here in the header, if I want this to be large, I can say class equals quote unquote large. Down here on main, I can say class equals quote unquote medium. And down here, I can have class equals quote unquote small. Now, I have taken one step backward by re-adding some of the aesthetics to the page, but it's not the actual properties. It's not the key value pairs. It's now more semantically nice because now I just know from reading the HTML what these things are going to look like, whereas the implementation details for all 4 of those adjectives is now relegated up above. And these are literally my words. I could change it to .foo and use class equals quote unquote foo, but obviously that would not be the best choice of words in this case. All right. Any questions on this? This now is what we would call a class selector by using literally the dot, even though the dot does not appear elsewhere, but dot means this is a class. These are not always the best syntactic design decisions that the world makes. All right, well, one last trick then. Notice that this is a little annoying that I'm still working in the same file, and if my classmate wants to clean up my aesthetics, make my homepage look way better, if my colleague wants to do the same, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually move all of this code to a different file, like a Python library or a C header file? Well, you can. Let me go ahead and delete that whole style tag. Let me add a confusingly named link tag, the href of which, let's call a new file styles.css. And let's say that the relationship of that file is that of style sheet. So this is a term of art in the world of web development. A style sheet is a text file that contains lots of styles, lots of CSS properties. Let me open my terminal real fast. And let me do code of styles.css. Enter. And in this file, I'm going to paste all of those same lines as earlier. But now they're in a separate file. And indeed, if I hide my terminal window and I give this file to a colleague, they can now work on the aesthetics of the page and make things a lot prettier than this, maybe use specific font sizes, maybe add colors and the like, whereas I can focus entirely on the HTML because this file now will reference that other. And if I go back to my other tab and reload, the content's going to be exactly the same, but now I'm using some separate file instead. Any questions now about these techniques here? No? All right, so with that said, let me show just one example now of what I called a moment ago frameworks. And this is where web development gets kind of fun, at least if you like this, especially if you like the sort of logical design, the presentation of information you care about, but you really don't want to struggle with like font sizes and colors and getting everything pixel perfect, so to speak. Let me propose that I open up here an example in just a moment in VS Code that I prepared in advance. And this one is going to be an opportunity to consider how you might take some of the data from last week, which we had, wherein we collected everyone's favorites, and lay it out in a really big HTML table. So I wrote this out in advance because it was a huge amount of data, but it's the same data from the Google form from last week. And you'll see already the hints of a table tag and these TRs. And I added a few other tags for aesthetics. It turns out when you have a more visually interesting header for your table, there's another tag called thead. There's another tag called tbody. These are not all that intellectually interesting. I just read the documentation and realized, oh, to make things prettier, I need a thead, a tbody, and so forth. But what's interesting here is that if I go to my index here and open this file called favorites.html, here is all of the data from last week's Google spreadsheet, which we exported as CSV, and I manually, before class, converted to just HTML. It's indeed a table, but it's really not pretty. Like the columns are really close together. It's kind of hard to distinguish one row from another, but this is just raw HTML written by me. Now, I could use CSS and some of the tricks we just saw to maybe change font size. There's ways to change color, background color, and a lot of things like that. But honestly, surely other people in the world have presented tabular data in pretty ways, right? I've been to many websites that have prettier tables than mine. Can I maybe use someone else's framework, someone else's CSS, include it in my page, but then stand on their shoulders and just make my stuff look prettier? Well, I dare say I can. Let me go ahead here and semi-secretly open up VS Code again, and let me grab a slightly different version of favorites.html that I also opened in advance, wherein I add this line of code instead. Give me just a moment to foreground this version, and the data is all the same as before, but I've added one of these link tags. And I'm not linking to my own styles.css. I'm using a popular library called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is just one of many popular libraries out there, free at that, that has a whole bunch of CSS files and soon JavaScript files that you can just use for free in your own projects, personally or professionally, that just make things look and behave better without you having to reinvent wheels. Now, to access their CSS, I had to read their documentation and grab this very long URL here. But it's the same idea. Link href equals quote unquote something. And I read their documentation, and they told me to add this. They told me that if I want my tables to be prettier, I have to add a class attribute to my own table tag and specify, a little weirdly, but this is what Bootstrap told me to do, a class called table. And that will make it a prettier Bootstrap table. And if I want to stripe it, like every other row is gray instead of white, just to make it pop a little more visually, I can also add a second class separated by a space called table striped. That's all I did. I added line 5 and I changed line 9, and that is it. The rest of the hundreds of lines in favorites.html are the same. But if I go back here now and reload the browser, now, thanks to Bootstrap, voila, like it's much prettier. Now I can zoom out, and that changes the font size just locally for me. And even if you don't love their aesthetics, I mean, this is easily better than my own there.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد رسولنا النبي الأمي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين نور هذه الأمة وضياؤها وشفيعنا يوم الحساب